All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Thank you for coming to this month's Lakes Region Forum, as well as Charles M. Bailey's 11th Annual Community Read, sponsored by the Bailey Library Foundation. This year, we had the privilege to read, thank you for the prop, by the way, Soon the Light Will Be Perfect by Dave Patterson, who is here to speak with us tonight. Mr. Patterson is a graduate of St. Michael's College and holds a master's degree from the Breadloaf School of English and is a Master of Fine Arts degree from the University of Southern Maine's Stone Coast program. His work has appeared in many publications, including Salon, Clare Literary Journal, and Blinders Literary Journal. He is also a finalist of the 2019 Maine Literary Award, and he teaches high school English here in Maine and at a Southern New Hampshire University's MFA program in creative writing. Please give a warm welcome to Dave Patterson.
Thank you. So I just want to thank you guys for having me. Thank you to Lee for that nice introduction. When I was asked to do this was actually in 2019. We planned to do it the summer of 2020. Not sure if you guys remember the summer of 2020. Exactly. Everything got canceled, and then things got rearranged. And so here I am in the summer of 2023. But I'm so excited to be here. When I think about my history of myself in Maine, I moved here in 2006. But Winthrop's the town I've been coming to the most because I fell in love with someone from Winthrop. So it's Anna. I've been coming here for 20 years, which is crazy. And a lot of the people here who have known me for 20 years remember when writing a book was a dream. When I showed up, I just graduated from undergrad, and I was just obsessed with the idea and learning the craft. And there's people in this room who have been supporting me for a long time. So it's so exciting to be here in this library, in a town, in a community, in a library that nurtured my wife, the love of my life. And my kids went to camp, here in Winthrop last week. So I love this town. And when I came in here, when we first moved here, we lived in Hollowell. And when I drove here, I had a little extra time, so I drove through Gardner and Hollowell, and I even drove all the way up through Sand Hill up in Augusta. Got lost in there for a second. I was like, oh yeah, that's what this neighborhood's like. And went to the Barnes and Noble in Augusta, oddly enough, where when I lived here, and I was like 23, 24, I used to sit and write short stories longhand. And I would grab books and read them and just dream about this happening. So I actually went there for a hot second. The barista was very overwhelmed and told me there were 10 drinks in front of me and there's no way she could make me any sort of drink. And I said, that's okay. So I just went and I sat there for a second. I remember writing these out longhand, which seems ridiculous now because writing is so hard and takes so long anyway. The idea of writing anything shorthand or longhand just seems crazy. But I just really remember coming here, and it was a dream, and now it's kind of surreal to be, standing here in front of you with a book that was actually published. Thank you. And I just want to say quickly that thank you for supporting this library. I don't know if you watched the news, but libraries overall, and definitely in Maine, are under attack. People are trying to ban books. There's a movement in the high school where I work, and the library is under attack. Curriculums are, I don't know if this library has, dealt with any sort of book bannings or people coming and trying to take books off the shelf, but, just being here, taking books out, supporting the library, keeps our libraries thriving, and they're such an important part of every community. So thank you. I don't know, Lee, if you faced any of this, but I'm sure someone here has wielded an email. And there's groups that are really organized in trying to attack libraries. So I just always want to keep that in mind when I'm in a library. They're, in a lot of ways, to a writer and a reader, they're sacred spaces. And so much more than books, but the books really are the foundation of it. And the idea of someone coming here and not be able to get a book seems very un-American to me. So I just want to put that out there. I try to say that whenever I'm in libraries. Hey, what's going on? Come on in and have a seat. Jamie, I won't give you a formal introduction, but it's great to see you. Okay, so now I can start shifting into this book. And I guess it's okay if you haven't read it, but can you raise your hand if you've read the book? This is beautiful. I've never been in the space doing a reading where so many people have read the book. Usually if it's at a bookstore, people are thinking about buying it, and they might buy it. Or if it's a library, they come because they're curious, and then they might check it out. But it's so exciting to be in the room where people have read the book. So I'm going to try to talk very little. I'm going to do a little bit of a reading, and then I really would love to hear questions if you have them, and reactions. And it's always fascinating to hear what people get out of this book. I know what I think I put into it, and then you get feedback or someone asks a question. I'm like, wow, I didn't even think of that part about the book. So it's a beautiful moment when I get to hear from people who've read the book. Okay, so just quickly, when I was getting a master's degree in writing from the University of Southern Maine, there was this piece of writing advice that was always thrown out all the time. It was just bandied about in workshops. And the idea is like, write what terrifies you. And the idea is that if you write what terrifies you, and sparks fly, sentences get urgency. Things seem to matter. Things are at stake for you as a writer, and things will be at stake for your characters, and that just makes for good fiction. And I remember being a good student, and I was like, all right, I'm gonna write what terrifies me. And I think at that time, I understood it with my head and not with my heart. Because this book taught me what that really means. Because early on, I would write short stories, and I would hear things in people's lives, and I would, like any good writer, steal them and write short stories about them because their experience sounded terrifying to me. But it was still always like once removed from me and my own experience. And so I did that for a while, and I actually wrote a book of short stories. And I put this collection together, and I actually got an agent in New York from this book of short stories written from other people's stories that I just stole and then fictionalized. And you know, the book of short stories started going out to publishers, and it got really close with a couple of my favorite publishers, Scribner's and Knopf. But I just kept getting rejected. My agent would be like, okay, I sent it to another publisher. They rejected it, but there's some really good feedback. And I'm like, I don't care. The feedback, I did care deeply. But the feedback was often, you should write a novel. Books of short stories are hard sells. People don't generally read them. They don't generally buy them. Which seems crazy to me, because I'm like, in short attention span in the 21st century, you think people would read short stories. But I actually think a book of short stories is hard. Because you read the first story, you finish it, and then you start the next story, and you have to enter a whole new world. Whereas a novel, you just get to enter that world and then just live in it for hundreds of pages. So I heard that so many times. We love your writing, but if this was a novel, we'd publish it. So my agent was like, well, you should write a novel. And I was like, sure. What is that? It seemed terrifying to me but this is what I wanted to do, and this is the dream I'd had for so long. And I'd gotten so close that I was like, okay, this is what I need to do. I need to write a novel. I've read many of them. I've read hundreds of them. I've taught them. I've taught structure. I've thought about them. I was like, okay, I'm going to write a novel. So then I sat around. I'm like, what am I going to write about? So I just returned to that early advice in grad school, which was write what terrifies you. And so I was just, sitting around, and I thought of another piece of writing advice that was talked about a lot at Stone Coast, which is the name of the MFA program at the University of Southern Maine. And there's this idea that everyone has a book inside them that only they could write. And if you're going to be a writer, it's your job to write that book, because your experience will speak to someone else's. And so I thought that a lot. I said that a lot to my creative writing students in high school. Maybe I didn't say the book, but I'm like, there's a story, because high school students always think they have nothing to write about. And I'm like, well, you have everything to write about. There's so much stuff to write about. And they'll start being like, Mom, my life's boring. See, I was raised by my uncle, and then my mom went to Montana for a while, and I'm like, oh my God, if you don't write your story, I'm gonna steal it. Just these wild things. I think we always downplay our own stories, and then you tell them to someone else, and they're fascinated by them. So I had those two pieces of writing advice knocking through my head, which was write what terrifies you, and everyone has a book inside them only they could write. So then I started thinking, like, well, what's my story? And then it was like almost immediately, I was like, oh, my childhood. Which, again, I didn't think that was that interesting, but, you know, I remember on long car rides to Maine, early on in my relationship with Anna, we would drive here and we would just talk about each other's lives. This is what you do. And I would tell her stories, and she'd be like, what? I think we all have these kind of stories from our past, where you start telling a story, and you're like, wait, not everyone was raised as Catholic as I was? Wait, not everyone was not, people were allowed to trick or treat? It's weird that I didn't trick or treat. And then it was like, I started thinking about my childhood, and there's this moment when I was a kid where my mom was diagnosed with cancer, and my dad lost his job. And it happened like simultaneously, and there was this like tumultuous period of my childhood that then my mother did recover. This is like a 2-year period. She did recover, and my dad did get a job again, and we didn't lose our house, and all those things we'd been afraid of didn't happen. Then my family kind of forgot about it. And then like good Catholics, maybe good northern New Englanders, we just didn't talk about it. Like it just wasn't something we talked about. But the more I thought about the skills I had gained as a fiction writer and storyteller, and really the story that was inside me that I needed to tell, I realized like, oh no, the story I need to tell is my story. And it's terrifying. Now, I knew it would lead to good sentences where there'd be a lot at stake for me. Every sentence that I wrote, there was a lot at stake for me. But it was also really hard because, you know, when I was a kid, my mom was sick for a while. Like, she had ulcers, and I remember her vomiting a lot and going to the hospital and getting operations before she was even diagnosed with cancer. And so I thought, like, well, what's the terrifying thing there is when I was a kid, I just remember having these thoughts that my mom was going to die. And they were when I started writing about it again, they became very real to me. Like, it's almost like, you know, you think you're over something, and you get back into it, and you're like, oh, that's still messy. I thought I was an adult. Like, I thought these things went away, but they really don't. And so I will say, right off the bat, my mom is very well. She beat cancer. She raised 4 boys. I don't know how she did it all. So she is, I always try to say that early on because I know that a lot of people have lost people to cancer, so, but my mom did make it. But that was a very real thing to me when I was a kid. So that came back, I was like, okay, I guess I gotta tell that story. And then the other part of the story was my dad losing his job. It was actually a more shameful part. When I was a kid, I remember we had food stamps. We were on food stamps back when they were like food stamps. Like they were like weird looking bills. And I remember my brother once brought us in to like, he brought me into my parents' room and was like, look at these. And I don't know, I thought it was a toy. I was like 10. I was like, what is that? Can we take it? And he's like, no, you idiot, those are food stamps. I was like, what does it mean? He's like, we're poor. I can laugh about it now. And it was still like, you know, something that I didn't necessarily think about that much in the moment. But there's a lot of shame that came with poverty. A lot of shame I still feel. And you know what's interesting is a lot of shame that people will come up to me when they read this book, and there's usually 2 big things they talk about: cancer and poverty. They talk with me about Catholicism. Like, I love when like recovering Catholics come, we have a moment together, and we're like, yeah, that was crazy, huh? Yeah, the blood of Christ, kind of thing. But people also want to know about the bras, and I'm willing to answer any question. My favorite part in a reading, I was in a reading in Vermont, and this woman came up to me, and she like wanted to talk, and I signed her book, and she's like, look at this. She goes, and she showed me her blue, a blue bra to the reading, and wanted me to see that. She's like, this is like from your book. I was like, oh my God, I love you. Right. But you know, people come, and I mean, I've been so lucky to hear the stories that people come tell me when they read my book. A woman came up to me at a reading and told me that she had cancer currently, and she had 2 small children. I could cry just telling the story. Ever since my kids have been born, I've cried so easily. I saw Linda Woods for the first time in years, and I started crying. I mean, I get like, I don't know what happened. It's beautiful, but also like startling. But she told me that my book helped her kind of see how her kids are processing what she's going through, which I thought was amazing. But with the poverty thing, it's usually like people will tell me stories, but it's like to the side. People will come and talk right to me about the broth, show me their broth, or talk to me about cancer. But like it's usually like an aside when someone talks to me about poverty. I had a coworker who read my book and saw me in the hallway and almost like looked around and like pulled me over and he's like, "Hey, you know, like your book was. I love reading your book. Like when I was a kid, we were poor. We used to get government cheese." And he's like, he's like, I still feel so much shame about that, and that kind of never goes away. And I think it's because I don't know. My argument is that in America, we treat poor people like it's their fault, and like they did it to themselves. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps, which is an impossible metaphor. And actually, some people know, and I won't say his name, but our financial advisor read my book, so he came and like talked to us about our humble finances. And you know, he shows up in his BMW and he has a house right on the lake, and he came and he had heard about my book and he's like, well, I'll read it. And he read it, and a month later I got an email, and it was this email about how he still will always feel poor, no matter how much money he makes, how like deeply ingrained that is, and that he had to like drop out of high school to work because his dad died and he didn't have any money coming in. And it's really fascinating, and I almost feel, like I still kind of feel like that, like this embarrassment from it. And I was a kid. I mean, being a teacher, when students sometimes talk to me about what they've gone through, and they feel this shame about something that they didn't do, and they're not in control of their situation, you know, I just want to say, like, stop. Like, it's not your fault. But it's hard to say it to myself. You know, you just internalize that, and whatever that is, it's still there. So when I decided, like, okay, write what terrifies you, what's the book inside of you, and I looked at those things, and I was like, oh no. And so, but you know, writing is a safe space. You know, you can get into your little cocoon. At the time, we had borrowed one of our neighbors had an Airstream camper, like a vintage Airstream camper that she wasn't using for the winter, and so she said, can I put it in your backyard? And we said, yeah, and I was like, can I use it to write? And she's like, yeah, there's propane, you can go out there and write. So I was able to write every day in this Airstream, vintage Airstream trailer. It was super cool. And I would just go and tell these stories and deal with everything that was coming up, and it was a lot. It was all these things that you're like, yeah, I thought I didn't process that, but here I am in it. And that's kind of the beauty of fiction, that it's not that you can, well, this idea of like, fiction writers, I think Hemingway said, you know, I had to lie to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. This idea that you tell the truth through lying. And you know, if you watch the movie, we all know, I know, life's hard. I mean, think about a great movie you've watched. You know everyone's pretending. All the actors are acting. Those are not those characters. But you fall into the spell of the story and of fiction. So I was able to do that, and you know, I wrote many drafts, and Anna's my first reader, so she would read them and give me feedback, and I was just doing this thing, and meanwhile, my book of short stories was not being published by more and more people. I was getting more and more really nice rejections. And I told my agent, I was like, well, I'm working on a novel. She's like, wonderful. As soon as you get it, give it to me. I was like, okay. And so it was right around the time that our daughter Alice was, Anna was pregnant with our daughter Alice, and she was due in May. And so it was that winter, and I was like, well, that was my due date. I knew I wouldn't be able to write for a few months after Alice was born. So I was like, okay, I'll write this thing, and I'll just get it done, then I'll send it off, and then I won't have to think about it being rejected, because we'll have a new baby. I don't know, if anyone does anything in the creative arts, I mean, most of what you're dealing with is rejection. Like, behind every success, every book is like 1,000 rejections. And I would just say, just keep going. Just keep going. So I send that book off, Alice is born, my agent's like, I love it. And I was like, oh. And then all of a sudden I was like, whoa. She's read like my childhood story. I feel very exposed. But I didn't think anything of it because, you know, when a baby's born, your brain isn't much anyway. And so then that's early in that summer, she was like, okay, here's some edits we should do. I was like, okay. So she gave me these really great edits. I worked on them. She helped me. It's kind of like, if you've seen this book, it sort of reads at times like short stories. And it's sort of like, you can plot my growth as a novelist. Like seeing like that shift from short stories to a novel. So I took her edits. They were brilliant. And I actually went to Bethel camping for a week and sat outside at a place, campground that had Wi-Fi. I brought a bulletin board with me so I could just go through these edits. I sent them back to her. A month later, she gives me a call and she's like, just so you know, I sent these to some editors who have read your short stories and liked them, and I thought that they would like this book. And I was like, okay. And they said no. she's like, no, they really like it. One of them wants to have a phone call with you. Now, I had 2 really long conversations with publishers in New York, with editors in New York about my book of short stories. So I was like, sure, I'll talk to this person. I'll have a long conversation, but I won't get my hopes up. And so I had a long conversation with John Glynn from HarperCollins, and he had grown up in Western Massachusetts. And he's like, I get what you're writing about. He's like, I was raised Catholic. I get this poverty-ridden town. He's like, I totally get it. And I was like, cool. Good to talk to you. Thank you. Thinking that my agent was gonna tell me 2 days that it was rejected, and then my agent got back to me the next day, and she's like, he wants to buy the book. I fell over. I was like, I'd worked so hard for so long, and I was like, it's happening. And then the second thing that popped in my head was like, oh my God, people are gonna read this book. That was a terrifying idea. Because again, it's safe when you write it and then you get it out there, and it's a very different thing. And so, the first thing I had to do was, I was like, people are going to read it. And then the next thought I had was, my parents are going to read this book. And that was a terrifying prospect because, it's very honest. That first chapter, there are some 30 cats. I made up a lot of this book. A lot of this book is made up. The craziest stuff I did not make up. That's real. I made up the other stuff, the connective tissue, to weave together the story. Because wow, my parents are gonna read this. The first story is about the cats. We did never tell anyone that we had 30 cats. My mother claims we only had 18. Maybe she'll concede 19. She'll never hit 20. And I'm like, Mom, there was at least 30 cats. She's like, no, David, no. And then I was realized that I sent it to my mom first. I got these early copies, and I sent it to my mom. Because I was like, I think she's going to be easier to win over. I don't know why, but you just think about your mom. You're like, okay. So I sent it to her, and her reaction was really. Everyone's reaction to this book has been fascinating because you can't predict how people are going to react, or even the people who kind of were part of my childhood journey with me. My mom was very supportive. And her whole thing was well, this was a very hard book for me to read because you're writing about a time where I couldn't be there as a mother. And I was like, whoa. Remember one time, I didn't think to ask this, but Anna once asked my mom, when you sold, my parents moved to Florida right around the time I started coming here in 2002, 2003. And Anna once asked, was it hard to sell the home? So my parents sold my childhood home and moved to Florida. And my mom, like that, didn't even think. She said, no, it was easy. We had a lot of painful memories in that house. And in a lot of ways, I brought those painful memories to the world. So I asked my mom, there's a lot of I don't know if you call it anti-Catholic, but questioning a lot of Catholicism in this book. And so I was like, well, what's Dad gonna think about this? Because my dad's a born-again Christian. My parents lost a child early on in their marriage. And my dad, he was, 23 years old. He converted to Catholicism and became very hardline Catholic. He was black and white. This is right. You'll go to hell. You won't go to hell, kind of thing. So I thought he was not going to appreciate that, my nuanced take on the Catholic religion. And my mother said, no. I think the hard part for him is that was a very hard time in his life because he couldn't provide for his family. And I was like, oh yeah, I didn't even think about that. So I sat down and I wrote my dad a letter. I took out this vintage hipster typewriter I have, and I typed a letter to my dad. And I told him, I was like, Dad, when I was a kid, every time when I was in elementary school, they'd say, who's your hero? Or write something about your hero. I was like, Dad, I always wrote about you. And I was like, I get emotional so easily. And I was like, Dad, this is the same thing. But now with all the nuanced complexities I understand about now that I'm an adult, that I have my own kids. So I sent it off in the mail with an early copy of the book. And I get a text message from my mom, like 3 days later. She's like, Dave, what did you write in that letter? I think your father's crying. Which is like, it's like once in a decade that might happen. And so as soon as I got that text message, I was like, all right, I won them over. And so those were the hardest parts. And then someone's like, well, what about your brothers? I have 3 brothers. There's only 1 brother in here because I tried to have more brothers. It was just too complex. There was too many characters. I got rid of them all. I got rid of them all except 1. And someone's like, what do you think your brothers are going to think? I was like, oh, I don't care. like a true brother. But the nice part about there being 1 brother is that now if anyone's like, wait, is that about me and they don't like it? I'm like, no, it's about the other one. And they're like, is this about me and they like it? I'm like, yeah, of course. But it's funny, they read it and my brother was like, yeah, that was hard to read because it was very much felt like that time in our lives. So it's been a fascinating journey. And sometimes I forget like what's in here. And this book came out in 2019. And as I was revisiting it for today's reading, I was like, oh yeah, there's that in there too. There's that. But again, it's the power of fiction, is that I was able to, take that and enter the world of storytelling and sort of like get all the plates spinning, and just get into the magic of storytelling and get through that. So that's sort of like the origin story of this book. And so I'd love to read you part of it, and then take any questions you guys have and leave a chunk of time for questions or insights, or if you're Catholic, anything you think I got wrong. I'm just going to say a word about the first sentence. This first sentence is a little electric for people. It contains 3 F words. And I will say, do I regret doing it 4 years later? I don't regret it. It was a conscious decision, and it was, I saw it as like a punk rock thing. Because I was about to literally open up my worlds and like these painful memories to people. And I thought, well, before anyone gets to judge me about these shameful things, the things I still feel ashamed from my childhood, like I'm gonna get 3 punches in. And here's the ridiculous thing about that, is that people who read books are good people. They're empathetic. They're caring. I didn't need to take any punches at these readers. It's not like someone watches Tucker Carlson and votes for Trump and then says, I'm going to sit down and read this novel. I'm sorry if I offended anyone, but it's just like the people who, and even if they do those things, there's this empathetic part of people, because that's what fiction does. That's what reading books does. I once heard this beautiful description that fiction and stories are the things that bridge the gap, the wide chasm that exists from my consciousness to yours and yours and yours, that we all live inside our own consciousness. And that fiction and stories are the things that bridge that gap. So I'm going to read the first sentence. Luckily there's only a baby here, so I don't think I'm traumatizing any children. You can just know that's kind of where I was coming from when I wrote that it was a little punk rock and it was a little like, I'm going to get my punches in, that I probably didn't need to get in. But I will say people talk a lot about that first sentence, about the bras. Okay. They say people who fuck a lot fuck like rabbits. They should say they fuck like cats. That would be more accurate, at least in my experience. My brother brings home the first cat, a brindle with green eyes. I found it in the woods, he says. It was alone. He cradles the cat. I've never seen him hold anything so tenderly. It terrifies me. My mother turns from the onion she sauteed in the cast iron pan. You should have left it, she laughs. The coyotes need to eat. She picks up a burning cigarette from the green ashtray and takes a drag. It'll need to get fixed, my father says. He's sitting at the old kitchen table, a white Formica table from the 80s. It's about to be given to a woman at church whose alcoholic husband moved to Montreal with a woman he met at a bar, loading the furniture into the bed of his truck before disappearing. My parents don't tell us any of this, of course, but the altar boys at church talk about it. Giving away the table is more than an act of charity for my parents. It's supposed to inspire my father to start building our new table. What will you name the cat? I asked my brother. He glares at me in a way that says he doesn't care what I think since it's his cat. Little does he know what's to come. Who's going to pay the vet bill? My father asks. My brother shrugs and takes the cat to his bedroom. My parents share a look and go back to their own worlds. My mother, her cooking. My father, his drawings for the new table. My mother looks healthy. We have a year before the cancer will bloom in her stomach. For now, it's a granular seed in her cells waiting. A few days later, I bring home the second cat. Because, fuck it, if my brother gets a cat, I get one. I'm riding my bike up our street when I see Travis Bouchard sitting on his lawn with 4 gray kittens. I lay my bike on the side of the road. Where'd you get those? I ask. He's on his back, letting the kittens nibble at his cheeks. He's younger than me, 10. He says, our cat had them in the garage. They're finally old enough to take away from their mother. Give me one, I say. I don't know where I'm getting the courage to be so forceful. He looks up at me. We're supposed to sell them, he says. Frank wants to make money. Frank is his mom's boyfriend. He moved in last fall. He has a beard and never combs a shock of brown hair. Behind Travis, their sad house lets out a sigh in the June heat. Frank removed the wood siding from last fall and never replaced it. The paper house wrap is torn in places and flaps in the hot breeze. It's common for the people in our town to use this paper as siding. It's no sin where I live. We just moved out of the old trailer park into this neighborhood. I'll give you $1, I say. You're not going to get more than $1 for those cats. Frank says 20 apiece, Travis says. He sits up and looks at me. 20's what we need. He must be echoing Frank's words. $1 today, I say, the rest later. The only money I have is a $1 bill I keep in my socks so my brother won't steal it. I remove it from my shoe and wave it in the air. I can't imagine how I'll get the rest, but I'm convinced I can take one of those cats home today for $1. I'll figure the rest out later. I don't know it now, but when I'm older, I'll discover that much of our country is built on the loose soil of this brand of lower-class economics. I don't know, Travis says. They're Chantilly Tiffany's. At least that's what the mother is. We don't know about the father. The kittens jump in his lap. One cat, a smaller one with yellow eyes, leaps and bites Travis's nose. Travis lets out a yelp and smacks the cat on the top of the head. A pinprick of blood blossoms on his nose. That one, I say. That one for $1. The rest later, he asks. The rest later, I say. He pinches the fur on the back of the kitten's neck and holds it up to me. Now there are 2 cats in our house. My father says, who's going to bring these cats to get fixed? But no one answers him. When fall arrives, my brother's cat fattens at the waist. She's pregnant, my mother says. The cat's name is Storm, and she's curled up in my mother's lap. My mother strokes the protruding belly. Storm has an affinity for my mother, especially after my mother vomits, which is something new. The doctors have told her she has an ulcer. She'll need surgery. The television has good reception today. We watch a news anchor tell the camera about the war in the desert is imminent. The image of a man in a military beret and a mustache flashes on the screen. Look at what your cat did to mine, my brother says. Your cat wanted it, I replied. Watch it, my mother says, continuing to run her hand over Storm's belly. But it's true. Storm went into heat with a frightening desire. Her low mewling grew each day until her high-pitched cry sounded like a child yelling, help, help. I named my cat John the Baptist to please my parents, though I knew they didn't want him. I call him JB. I saw the way he stalked in circles around Storm. It was the first time I'd seen carnal desire. I felt an animal inside me move, and I knew it was something to hide, what Father Brian calls the sin of lust. A tan tank rolls across the sand on the television screen. My father comes into the living room, holding the plans for the table he's going to begin in the spring. Since my mother became sick, he started spending more time in the garage, troubling over his workbench. We used to build those tanks, he says, at the plant. They're very efficient machines. Mr. Whitaker thinks we might get the contract to do more if the war starts. He's standing in front of the Sacred Heart of Jesus poster framed on our wall. The eyes of Jesus follow us as we move throughout the room. My brother laughs sometimes, saying in a mocking voice, Jesus is always watching. My mother's slow strokes over Storm's belly catches my father's eye. That cat is pregnant, he says. My brother says, it's because of John the Baptist. His cat ruined mine. Outside, JB slinks along the lawn, stalking a robin, ready to pounce. Storm gives birth to 7 kittens on Thanksgiving. We're having the meal at our house with no other family because my mother has been vomiting more. The surgery for her ulcers was supposed to stop this. They opened her up, made the incision, and stapled her back together with a crooked row of 25 staples. My brother finds Storm halfway through the labor. He yells. We huddle on the closet threshold, watching Storm clean the oily kittens. My shirts are ruined, my brother says. A thick yellow liquid stains his dirty shirts. Storm licks at the liquid, and I think I may be sick. The smell of the turkey roasting in the oven mixes with the sour smell of birth. Despite my mother's illness, she's demanded she cook the meal, though she only manages the turkey, mashed potatoes, and the cranberry sauce that comes in a can. It's beautiful, my mother says. She hugs me close. We have 9 cats, my father says. By Christmas, Storm is pregnant again, and only 1 kitten has been adopted. No one wants our cats, especially not my father. My mother sleeps on the couch now, so she won't wake my father when she's sick in the night. Storm sleeps on my mother's stomach. The doctors aren't sure why my mother isn't getting better. My father brings the plastic tree up from the basement, and while my mother lies on the couch stroking Storm, we set up the decorations. I arranged the nativity scene with a ceramic Mary, Joseph, baby Jesus, and 3 wise men in a manger my father built from particle board years ago. The kittens stalk around us in the living room. They've grown bigger. They prowl around the house, lounge on the furniture, jump on the mantle above the fireplace, perch on the kitchen counter, claw at the wallpaper, shit under our beds, climb over our shoulders as we watch television, gnaw on our sneakers. We act as if we can't see them. When the tree has been erected and the colored lights strewn through the fake branches, my father says, turn off the lamp. This is part of our tradition. I switch off the light in the living room. For a moment, we're all standing in the dark. The sun set hours ago. Outside, the soft sweep of snow blows against the window. Here we go, my father says. He bends to plug in the lights. The holiday cheer breaks through a sadness that has settled over us like a layer of dust coating a window. There's a popping sound as electricity runs through the metal prongs of the Christmas lights and the tiny bulbs click on. The colored lights sparkle on the shiny needles of the fake Douglas fir. The only sound in the room is my mother's deep, slow breaths. It's what she does when she's trying not to be sick. My eyes adjust to the dark room. The shadows of the cats approach the illuminated tree. One by one, they are drawn to the light. Everything is still until one cat, probably Peter, we've named them all the kittens after apostles, raises his paw and swats at the lights. The other cats join in until the tree begins to shake. Get out of here, my father yells, and rushes at the cats. Get! They dart in every direction. Even Storm is startled in her pregnant state as she leaps off my mother and disappears down the dark hallway. I find Storm in my brother's closet again, pulling out the slick bodies of kittens. She's making a moaning sound. This time, when I yell down the hall that she's giving birth, my brother comes into his room, and he's only there to check on his clothes. He's kept his closet clear since the last time. He shoves me against the wall. These cats are your fault, he says. After Storm finishes giving birth to 6 kittens, we have 14 cats in our house. I try giving one to Travis down the street. I carry it under my jacket. Snow falls at an angle, stinging my face. I hope this cat will pay off my debt to Travis and Frank. Maybe they can sell it. But in my experience, nobody buys cats. I knock and Travis pulls open the front door. He says, you owe me $19. Frank is getting pissed. I've been avoiding Travis all winter. How about I give you 14 cats and we call it even, I say. Or maybe just one. I produce the gray cat from under my coat and hold it up. It's meow, a faint whisper. In the background, Frank yells at a football game on the television. I need the money, Travis says. Frank knows you owe us. The cat wasn't worth $20, I say. Frank wants the money, he says. Travis closes the door and I stay in for a moment on the front steps. Snow builds on my shoulders. I slide the cat under my coat. The paper siding slaps against the house in the February chill. We can't escape the cats. When I try to take a shower, 2 cats are in the tub. In the basement, cats hide behind the broken washing machine. They saunter over my father's workbench in the garage, crawl across the kitchen counters, cry in the night. My mother is getting sicker. She doesn't want us to know, so she turns on the water in the bathroom sink when she vomits, but we can still hear her. My brother and I stand at the closed bathroom door while cats weave through our legs and claw at our toes. The divide that's starting to grow between my brother and me only disappears in the moments when we press our ears to the bathroom and listen to our mother vomit. The snow doesn't thaw till April. It's been a hard winter. In the middle of the night, I wake to the sound of an ambulance. Red lights flashing on my bedroom walls. I walk out of my room holding a cat that's been sleeping on my chest. All the lights are on in the house. In the living room, my mother is laid out on a stretcher. An oxygen mask obscures her face. My father stands over her while my brother is hunched on the couch behind him. Cats move over the mantle, the carpet, the couch. There are so many cats now, we no longer name them. One jumps up on the stretcher and sits on my mother's sternum. A paramedic with a tight ponytail pulls the cat off my mother and drops it on the ground. Another one takes its place. The paramedic removes this one as well. She looks at my father and says, "Do you guys raise cats or something?" My father's been crying. He looks up at her. "What cats?" he says. Annoyed, she goes back to my mother. For a moment, I see our life through her eyes. Every cat comes into view. The woman shares a look with the other paramedic, a young guy, maybe 20, with big hands that work at securing my mother to the gurney. He looks up at me. "That cat looks pregnant," he says. I look down at the black cat in my hands. I run my fingers along its belly. Tremors of life ripple below the ribs. I drop the cat on the carpet and start to cry. My mother looks at me through the medicated mist that surrounds her. She smiles and tries to speak, but she can't talk through the oxygen mask. The paramedics wheel her out into the spring night. There's a hard smack as the front door closes. "Get dressed," my father says. "We're going to the hospital to be with your mother." None of us moves. The cats crawl all around us. "Get dressed," my father repeats. "We need to leave this house." In the hospital waiting room, my brother falls asleep in the chair with his mouth open. My father turns the pages on a magazine he doesn't seem to be reading, and I fall in and out of sleep on the couch next to my father. "Shouldn't have called an ambulance," my father says, staring down at his magazine. "It's too expensive. I should have driven her." He turns the pages of his magazine so hard he nearly tears the glossy paper. His legs are shaking rapidly. They vibrate the couch. My father wakes me when the doctor comes out to get us. We're led into a hospital room where my mother sleeps with tubes in her arms. My brother rubs his eyes as if he thinks he might still be sleeping in the waiting room. "She's stable now," the doctor says. "It was just a little incident, nothing life-threatening, but we have an idea why she's still having these episodes." "Why?" my father asks. "We think it's cancer," the doctor says. "We'll have to run more tests." A machine connected to my mother beeps loudly. She stirs as if to wake, but only lets out a sigh and falls back asleep. So you guys know that if having read that first chapter, at the end, Frank comes for the $19, and the father and Frank get in a fight. And then they take all the cats and bring them to get them out of the house. So I would love to open this up if anyone has any questions. Don't be afraid to ask anything. Yes. Yes, please.
Was his friend, whose father, the boy that he was chasing through the black Cadillac, the mother had the black Cadillac, and then the girl that is his friend, who he hits with the car. There was a moment, the mother or someone had told him he was going for a joyride. And in that moment I thought, was that a suicide pact? Did he?
Oh.
It wasn't.
I didn't believe it was.
Okay.
I mean, I literally believe. I believe stories are bigger than us. I believe that I have my interpretation.
That was what I thought. I thought that this girl who was very troubled, and his other friend.
Yeah, Shane, whose father died of cancer.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought it was like a suicide pact between them.
I would say they were both on the edge. Shane, because he had lost his father, was driving this car underage. And then Taylor. So this book originally, you guys have read the book, so I'm just going to say, I mean, originally no one died in this book. And my agent was like, you've written a tragedy and no one dies. She's like, she's like, that's dark to say, but you get to the end of this book and she's like, the mother seems like it's going to get better. And I was like, yeah, because that's what happened in my childhood. And she's like, but like, it's like you're like breaking a rule here. And she was like, the mother doesn't have to die. And I'm really glad that the mother doesn't have to pass away, because it would be very hard for me to talk to people who had read this book and say, like, I'm so sorry your mother passed of cancer, and share stories. And it would just be a lot to then have to say, like, no, my mother is well. So as I was looking around the playing field at these characters, and that girl, Taylor, is based on a real friend of mine as a child who did not die, who revealed something to me, as Taylor reveals to her, to the narrator. A girl came into our neighborhood and befriended us, and it did reveal that to me. It has haunted me ever since, that she had been assaulted by her mother's boyfriend. And I was like 10 when she told me, and it still haunted me that I never told anyone. It still is one of those things you look back and you're like, ugh. And so as I was thinking, like, well, if someone has to die, which is a heavy thing to say, but I looked around and I said, well, who pays the price in our society? It's often women and vulnerable children. So it was kind of the hardest part of this was when the book was set to be published and I was working with the editor, with my editor, and he was like, so this moment is powerful. But he's like, in that first time through, he's like, I can't see it. Like, how did she die? What happened? And so, in the Airstream trip camper that I had in my backyard, I remember, this is what I learned, like, a lot of times writing isn't writing. It's just sitting there and imagining, and not writing until you can see it all. And sometimes I'll still do that now, I'll almost meditate. As soon as I can see everything in, like, HD, and I can describe it, then I'll start writing. So, do you guys remember that show Twin Peaks? Mm-hmm. So the Twin Peaks theme song I've often been obsessed with, because it moves from major to minor scale, and it goes back and forth, and it never settles, and it always has given me an unsettling feeling. So I put that on, and then I just imagined it. What happened to her? How did she die? And so that was actually the most painful scene of the whole thing to write, because I just had to imagine this horrific scene.
And I kept waiting. I'm like, it's going to be revealed. He's going to figure it out. He's like, you know, and it never did. And I'm like, oh, maybe the author wants us to, you know, just wonder about that.
No, I love that
You
reading.
didn't, but I did wonder.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of these characters are kind of on the brink and are pushed to the edge, because I think that's what happens with poverty in extreme sort of instances.
Thank you. I used to need closure.
Yeah.
Now I can.
Well, I'm glad I could give it to you. Yeah. It just is an unfortunate meeting of two troubled people. Any other questions? Yeah.
What's your next book about?
I have been writing a book for the last 4 years. So when this book was coming out, I was like scared about a lot of things. I was like, first off, everyone's going to read the story about my life. And the other thing was like, wait, no one's going to read this book. That's even worse. So like the one thing I could control was writing. So I was like, all right, I'll just start something new. And another maybe not uplifting book. It seems to be a theme right now. So the next book I want to write, after I finish this one that I'm going to tell you about, is going to be a book about school shootings, and it's going to be hopeful and uplifting. I can like see it. I can start to see it now. That's another whole story about having, as a teacher, I've sat through, I don't know if other teachers in this room have, but like lockdowns, being told that there was idea that there could be a shooter on. So this is I teach at Gorham High School. This has happened a number of times. But that's going to be a hopeful book, I promise. It doesn't sound like it can be, but I believe it can be. So when this book was coming out, you have a year. You like present the final draft, and they're like, cool, it'll come out in a year. And so I just had a year to like sit around and worry, I guess. That's what I do. And so I thought, okay, back to the drawing board, right? What terrifies you? What's your story you have to tell? And so when I was in my 20s, my younger brother had a substance abuse problem, and they involved opioids. And he got arrested. He totaled a couple trucks. He moved down to Louisiana, and he was away from me. And there was a time where I just kept waiting for the phone to ring to find out that he had died. I mean, there was just a really visceral time. And so what I did is I started there, but I moved it to Florida, where my parents live, and I spent 20 years going to Florida, and that's like the wackiest place. I always say that Florida is not the South. It's not in the South, it's the Wild West. Like, you feel like anything could happen at any moment. Both beautiful and terrifying, because it's so wacky and such a transient population. So it sort of explores a family who deals with substance abuse from a daughter, and has to navigate that, and then after she passes and ODs, they have to navigate that and separate and come together. So I've done a lot of research. If you looked at my search history about the Florida opioid epidemic, and born in Maine too. I mean, this is a lot talking about that new book, but I was catching the Peaks Island ferry with my 2 kids, and we were in the bathroom, and then someone just collapsed in a stall, and I just grabbed my 2 kids and I took them out, and I went and found someone. I was like, someone just collapsed in there, and it's almost like this, really, I mean, a terrifying, it happened again. Someone's like, someone go get the Narcan. It was so commonplace. It's just happening everywhere. Maine has, for a long time, for a few years now, averaged almost 1 opioid overdose death a day. And so it's just heavy, and it seems to be everywhere. And so I just started there with sort of my personal experience with it, my family, and going out. As you can see, my family loves that I write. That one's gonna be live. I should also say that my brother does not do those drugs anymore. He lives in Maine, and he's a master gardener, and he's overcome a lot, and is my hero. But that was a decade of his life that he went through. So. Yeah.
Back to book one. Have your contemporaries, people you grew up with in Vermont, about the book, and any reactions, thoughts they have about it?
Yeah, I kind of have been cowardly, and I've been too afraid to do a reading at my hometown library in northern Vermont, because it doesn't paint the town in the best light. But I've had definitely people who grew up there. I mean, I had a graduating class of 120 kids, and only 87 students actually graduated. I remember teenage pregnancy was a big thing in my town. There's a lot of poverty. The most, Milton, Vermont, is where I grew up, and it has the most trailer parks per capita in Vermont, and the most dirt roads. And it's only 20 minutes outside of Burlington. It's not even that far up. So a lot of people, it's been a really good reception. I mean, people have agreed. Some people feel like what's a term that one of my mother's friends used, I made it look a little more redneck than she thought it was. And I was like, I don't know. That's not how I saw it. But it's interesting, so it is my hometown. But when I taught with Linda up in Fairfield, and you would drive out. I mean, the number of students, I remember being shocked, and this probably existed in my hometown, I didn't know it, because I wasn't an adult, I wasn't privy to this information, but I remember teaching at Lawrence High School, and being told, the number of kids in our school at that time, in 2005, 6, and 7, that didn't have indoor plumbing, didn't have running water, and it was a shocking number. And it was the other thing when I started writing this book, I was like, well, I don't really I think I say Vermont once in this book. And to me, I got to central Maine in that area, and I was like, well, this is northern New England. This is this kind of rural poverty that exists with extreme beauty and extreme sublime beauty, and also has this juxtaposition of poverty. So there are people who think I nailed it in my hometown. I think there are plenty of people who grew up. There's a lake. My town does border briefly Lake Champlain, so there are some nice houses. People had a very different experience. But it was funny. I didn't reach out to do a reading in my hometown. Now I feel like I should. I should reach out and just do it and just see what people say. Because honestly, all the fears I've had about this book, about it not being received well or people being critical of it, none of it's happened. I mean, people have been so kind. So I should do that. Any other questions? Ooh, let's see. Yeah.
Me?
Yes, you.
I have a few questions.
Yes, please.
Try to remember. Kind of felt left hanging about when the lasagna was dropped on the floor.
Mm.
You don't really know kind of what happened after that. Was there a reason for that, or
Yeah.
what happened? What happened?
One of the things I love, like my aesthetic and like storytelling aesthetic, is that like a thing happens and you don't get that closure, and like the not getting that closure just is like this bell that doesn't stop ringing. And so you do that a bunch, and then you just by the end of it have this like, it's almost like this like unsettling effect that like, why don't I know? And part of me was also like, there are times that things would happen in this book and they would get more attention, and I would get away from like the mother and the father losing his job, and then it would be like too far away, or the kid stuff would become too kid-like, you know what I mean? And it would be too, I don't know, it just didn't ring the right bell. So I was like, okay, I am going to have these open threads. And that has annoyed a lot of readers. I will actually say there's a lot of people who don't like that kind of stuff. My new novel doesn't do that. You know, this book also is told in vignettes. A big inspiration for this book was The House on Maple Street by Sandra Cisneros, which came out, I believe, in the 70s. And it's a book told in vignettes. And I will say, I love that book. It almost reads like a book of poems more than a novel. But I will say, when I teach that book to students, a lot of them hate it. Because they're like, what happens? What happens? And I guess for me, a lot of the power of story, for me, I love, it takes place in the white spaces on the page that you don't fill in. And so I just love that. But I can clearly see that you do not like that.
I was just curious.
It's fine, yeah. It's like an aesthetic choice, but yeah, that's sort of where it came from. I also a big inspiration in this book is a book called We the Animals by Justin Torres, and it's a novella. It's told in vignettes, very much like The House on Mango Street, and it just has these like evocative little like vignettes, and like you're like, what's happening in the space between all these stories? And I just love that. Did you have another question?
So the rocks in the bed, and they're doing the penance to try to make their family whole and healthy again, and to try to make everything better. Was that fictionalized, or is that real? And then I kind of thought about, was that the reason maybe Taylor died? That maybe the family is more whole now, and because of all that, and if you thought that maybe that was the reason that Taylor died.
Like their family comes together and hers comes apart.
Right.
Oh,
Is there a
yeah.
connection with that? And is
Yeah.
that fictionalized, or
Well,
do
you
you
can
actually keep on rocks?
Well, I felt Catholicism terrified me. Like, it's full of these stories about saints who were martyrs and mutilated. Like, that was all heavy stories. And as a kid, maybe I was bound to be an English major. Like, I took them very seriously, very literally, and like, I asked some of my three brothers, none of them seem to have these like conflicts about religion that I have. But I feel like I internalized it, and when bad things would happen, I thought it was because I did bad things. But as with the bras, like, internal things are death in fiction. When you describe someone's internal feelings, like, it has to be external. It has to be like, I had a writing professor who said, you have to dramatize things. Meaning, like, if you feel fear, well, you don't say fear. You show fear. Like this show don't tell. And so when I was kind of thinking about this idea of like, I had a lot of like hang-ups, like a lot of fears about the second coming. Like I thought it was going to happen imminently as a child. Like I really felt that. And so as I tried to think like, what could this character do? And then when I was, what's the word I'm looking for? Confirmed in the Catholic Church, you have to pick a saint. And I chose Saint Dominic. And Saint Dominic was a child saint, one of the only child saints, and he was like this perfect soul who died, perfect kid who died young and then was canonized. And so I just thought, like, I was doing research for this book, I was like, let's just check out Saint Dominic, let's see if something's there. And he used to do this child saint used to like wear, they call them hair suits, and would wear them under his clothes because he felt like he was a sinner. And like he was like by all means perfect, and I was like then tortured by this idea. Why did this kid do this? And he would sleep with Roxy in his bed. So I was like, oh, the saint that I chose for confirmation into the Catholic Church did all these things, and I was like, perfect. I'll just take them all. And it's a way to externalize these internal like feelings that he's having towards them. What was the next question?
How is the relationship with the healing of the family and then the Taylor was killed and the son kind of felt like that what he was doing helped heal the family, but then something bad happened to Taylor or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, I think one thing writing this book and getting inside my like childhood psyche, and one of the ways into this book was I wrote it from a child's perspective. It just wasn't working. So what I learned is what I did was I shifted so it's from someone who's older looking back on his childhood, because I learned when I get around my brothers, like I think I've like grown and I'm so like well adjusted now. It takes like 4 minutes with them and they push all my buttons and I'm like I am 12 again. How did they do this? And I thought about this. I was like, oh, my narrator can be an adult and a child because we all are. Like I think of someone in your life who can send you back to your 12-year-old self. And you don't want it to happen, but they can do it so quickly because they know your buttons. So one of the things that, as I was writing this book, I was like, whoa, I just want to go inside this book and give this kid a hug and tell him everything's going to be okay. But that makes for bad fiction. So you have to let bad things happen. And I do think he internalizes this. I think one of the things that Taylor does a lot in this book. Really, Taylor makes this into a novel. And I can talk more about that. But her character, like she looks at his family. He looks at his family and he sees a sick mom and an unemployed dad, and them destined to go back to a trailer park. And he just sees chaos and destruction and just uncertainty. She looks at that family and she thinks a mom and a dad and a home. And she was when I saw how she saw the family, I think she allows him to see his family as this beautiful unit when he sees it through her eyes. That's why Taylor's also the character. The mother's sick a lot through the second part of the book. And Taylor was the character who I was like, she'll go in the bedroom. She'll show us the mother in this moment. The narrator never would do that. He'd be too afraid of his mother getting sicker because he did that, of it being wrong. And so Taylor's allowed to do this. And I think he does feel a lot of guilt about what he has and what she doesn't. I didn't see him as feeling that he was I do think he feels responsible. Now that I'm thinking back at the end of this book, because she puts a lot on him and he can't take it. And even though he's 12, what is he supposed to do? I think we take those things on. I mean, I think if we all search back hard enough in our lives and thought about our past lives, there are things we regret that we probably had no control over and shouldn't regret, but we still do. So I think he definitely regrets that and feels responsible that she's out there alone on the road when she asked him to come along with her. And he was like, I can't. So yeah, it's a heavy relationship. She's a heavy character for me. It was very hard. Yeah.
Can you talk about the project that the dad had, building the table? What did you intend with that?
Well, my dad really built a table that really exists in Florida at their house. And my brothers and I all fight over it. I'm like, well, I put it in a book. I think I get it. So this table was a joke in my family for a long time. Because my dad worked on it it was supposed to be a weekend project. It took him 2 years. And I think partly because of all the things that happened in our lives. But I saw this, I always, when I'm writing stories, I'm always like, I love having like a time, some sort of ticking time thing going on. Like I love writing stories that take place at a party, because a party will end. So then I have to make all the things about a story happen in a short amount of time. And compression is always good. And a ticking time. So I know that when I realized it was going to be one summer, I was like, well, over the course of the summer, the father's going to build this table. And this table gets to be a marker of time. And I know the book's going to end around the time the table's finished. And just as like a device, it allows me as a writer to sort of wrap things up and get things and make things happen. And I can't waste time. So I'm like, well, this table's being finished. These characters have to do things. And so I saw it also as a way that the father had it's like his love language, right? This idea of like a repressed northern New England dad who can't express his feelings, but can put them into this beautiful table. It also gave him a thing to obsess over. His life is falling apart, but he can make a beautiful table. He can make lines. When things get messed up, there's a point where Taylor like destroys the table. And I see that as her like saying, like, you get this beautiful family, you don't get this table too. And the dad looks at it, and when I was writing that, I was like, oh, the dad wouldn't be mad. He'd almost be like happy to have this thing to work on. I think he can get right. I think we all have those things when the world's falling apart. This thing like, I can do this. It's why like after a long week of teaching, when I feel like I've just failed all of my students and been the worst teacher ever, I'll mow the lawn. And then I get to look at it and be like, look at that lawn. It's done. It's clean. Everything's good. And, you know, I think it allowed him to do that. I had someone who came up to me and they were like, I love the table, the altar imagery and the holiness and the true meaning of God inside of this family. And I was like, yeah, I totally meant that. But that's the thing I mean by, I think stories are bigger than we are. You know, they have their own logic and their own magic, and so it was a really helpful device for me. And the table does actually exist, and it's held up well. Yeah.
I just want to say I read the book a while ago, and I think I'm right when it serves me right. But the part I liked the most about it, I think, was when they were filling the ball against the garage.
Yeah.
I was right there. It was neat.
And like I said, I try to be cinematic. I think a lot of writers, and I envy them, writers who can write kind of abstractly and take you into these abstract ideas and then come back to the concrete. I'm just kind of about the concrete. I'm about that, like, what is happening? It's this idea of, like, pull everything else away. There's this line that one of my favorite writers, Raymond Carver, said, sometimes don't use any tricks as a writer. Don't use any gimmicks. Sometimes the writer's job is just to gawk at things, like a rainbow or an old shoe on the ground. And every time I try to do more and these fancy things, when I pull away all the fancy things, the thing I'm gawking at isn't that interesting. I'm like, the story's wrong here. And so I just want to pull it all back. I admire like Richard Russo, who writes these like 600-page books that weave in and out of that. But I guess for me, sometimes though, I'm like, pitter patter, get at her. Like, get right to the story. But yeah, I try to be very cinematic. I also, like I said before, have to see it really vividly to write it well.
The table was cool. The whole aspect, there was a lot. There was a lot more going on because then him and his brother bonded over the table, and then after Taylor died, he went like looking for her mark and couldn't find it. You know,
it definitely was a concrete centerpiece that I could put a lot of ideas in. And ideas are kind of useless because they're vague. There's like brass band smoke, but you can touch table. And if you can imbue it with all this, that's the hard part, is like you have a symbol, but you don't want to like be like, hey reader, symbol. You know, because then it destroys the magic of it. And a lot of these things happen, the best ones, symbols in all my writing, happen organically. Like I don't see it. And then like the symbol's 3 steps ahead of me. And then by the time I see it, I'm like, oh, now just don't ruin it. Don't call too much attention to it. It's usually about trying to pull back as opposed to doing more. Yeah.
So the characters didn't have any names, so then Taylor and Shane, was there a reason for that? Or what was the reason for that?
Yeah, I think it was the same kind of thing I did for not trying to name the town, and again, not wanting to put it squarely in Vermont, even though I think I do mention that at one point. It's this idea of like, I think, again, I come back to being a teacher, like, I've just met so many kids who've gone through so many terrible things. And I was like, it's more than my story. It's like every poor kid in northern New England who's dealt with this and not had support. And like, so for me, it just allowed them to be more than just me and this like kind of anonymous family. Some people hate that too. But I did like it as a device, and sort of like, because the narrators also was like the narrator, he wouldn't say his own name naturally, and he wouldn't say his brother's name, just be my brother, my father. And so I just started telling the story like that, and I really liked it. And then again, I just think more of like, this story is more than my story. It's so many stories of so many kids I've met in these kind of situations. Any other questions?
I
Yeah.
have two actually.
Yes, please.
I'd love to know about you as a little guy.
The what?
Did you develop that love of writing? Was it when you were little, as a teen? And I'd love the title. And I'd love to know more about how you chose that. What part in the process did you pick that out?
Yeah. Well, I can start with the first question. As a kid, I wasn't that into writing. I didn't grow up in an artsy house. I didn't grow up in a household full of books. I just didn't.
Really?
No. And I didn't even, I loved music. I think music was my first in. And I remember getting a Bob Dylan cassette and listening to Bob Dylan's greatest hits and just hearing those songs and being like, what is going on here? Like, there was so much magic inside his lyrics. And I do remember being a kid and just writing a lot. Like when teachers would ask me to write, I could sit and write and everyone would be done and I would still be writing. But it just never struck me to write. I didn't write a story until after I graduated from college. I was too afraid to take creative writing classes. It just seemed like, I don't know, just kind of like the way I grew up, it sort of felt like to write a story was like, who do you think you are? Like, who do you think you are that you could tell a story? And it just felt that. And really it was reading stories by Raven Carver, Andre Dubus, the short story writer, not Andre Dubus III, who wrote The House of Santa Fog. It was just in Maine. It was about his dad, was a short story writer. Richard Ford, who has a house in Maine. Richard Russo, his book of shorts, The Empire Falls, and his book of short stories that takes place in Waterville, The Horse Child. These were books about lower middle class families and characters. These were about. I remember reading them and being like, "Well, you can do that." I had taken British lit and early American literature in college, and I was like, "Well, this seems to be high art." And then I read Raven Carver in a short story about a kid who skips school and catches a trout, a trout with his friend, and everything's going wrong in his family, and he loses the fish. And he has to go home, and his father's works as a mechanic. And it was such high art. What he does in that story is such high art. And I was like, you can make high art out of lower middle class lives. And it really felt like I felt seen, reading those stories. And so once I read those, I started writing all of my copies of Raven Carver stories. And that's really where it came from. And I guess I don't know, I think all families need storytellers. And people would tell stories, and the more I read people like Richard Ford or Richard Russo even, you're like, oh, they're actually just writing these their uncle who probably told great stories, in the oral tradition, would sit around and just drink a light beer and tell a story. I feel like they're invoking a lot of that voice. And so once I realized that was on the playing field, that was allowed, it was just over. And so the title of this book, I did not come up with it. So
You borrowed it?
it's a line from the book. It's in the last chapter, and I wrote that line. So my agent was like, I first had called it Chemo Dreams. And my agent was like, I don't know. I was like, all right, fine. It's amazing how cold, in a very practical way, the writing world is, in New York. Right? So my agent's in New York, the editor, and you say these things, and they're like, yeah, just cut that. You know how much of my spirit I put into this? How much thought and how genius I thought I was? So I had Chemo Dreams, which I liked. They didn't. And then I had A Land of 1,000 Amens, which is another line that I really liked. But then the editor was like, people will think this is Christian stuff, or some there's something. And I was like, fine. So my agent was like, she looked at it, she's like, what about Soon the Light Will Be Perfect? It comes from the last chapter, so the reader gets to get there, and then they get the title. It has that idea of this idea of anticipating something. The light isn't perfect now, but soon it will be. I feel like so much of this book is waiting for things to get better. And she's like, listen, we'll just put it on there. Because editors love to change. Editors love to name books. It's their thing. So the editor's probably going to want to name this book, and you're probably not going to have a choice. So we just put it on there, and I fell in love with it, and then they left it. But it is funny. Naming something is very hard. And so you think about it a lot, and then casually they'll be like, nope. You're like, okay. Any other questions? Yeah?
as much as I had to force myself through the first chapter of your book, I got towards the second chapter and I thought, I need to go back and read that first chapter again. And hearing you read it tonight, you told us the whole story, but we had to really pay attention because I was focusing on the cats. I'm not a cat lover. So
Me neither.
so I'm like, that is an amazing piece of writing, to be able to tell a story. You told us your mother was sick. You told us your father lost your job. You told us you had a brother. You told us so much, but you told it through the cats. It's sort of like you kept going with that because you knew your father was going to make the table, and you kept making the table and through the story. He couldn't control much, but he could keep his family around the table.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking through the whole book, you need to redeem this table better work, you better keep his family together. And it did work. He was able to keep his family together. So kudos to you for that amazing ability to write in a way that made us be a part of your family, even though we didn't know your name.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And those cats too, I mean, like writing in certain ways is sleight of hand. So it's like, if you're just like, the mother has cancer, is getting sick and has cancer, like, it's just like, it's too much there. But if you have these cats going over, it's like don't look at this hand. When all in a magic trick, the trick is happening in this hand, but the magician gets you to look over here, and then at the end it's like, and you're like, whoa, how did you do that? And it's like, it was misdirection. And so the cats worked with that, and it was also a metaphor for these kids who are growing inside the mother, outside in the house, like the cats keep multiplying. Cats multiply fast. I'll tell you from experience. That first line is actually true.
You were ignoring the cats, just like so much was being ignored within the household. It's very interesting.
It is very interesting. It's almost like, anything can become normal. In almost any situation, anything can become normalized. It's almost like you need someone on the outside to see it, to be like, ooh. Like when I started telling Anna stories, I'm like, yeah, when we had like 27 cats, and then my brother did, she's like, excuse me? I hit rewind, how do we get back to the cats? Yeah.
What I really enjoyed most about the book, different books like grab you in different ways. Like you don't always feel when you're hooked or when you fall in love with the character, and I love when that happens, and when you're like aware, you're like, oh, like that was that moment. And for me, and I was embarrassed to say this early because I'm like, I don't know what the name of it now, because we didn't, nobody knew.
A lot of people do. They come to me like, your character's name is, sorry, I can't remember.
It, but it was when he was running through and chasing the other boy through the junkyard, and he said, I'm about to show you your future. I'm clairvoyant, and he says, it's comments like this that get him, in trouble, like with my brother and his friends. And that was like the moment that I loved that kid.
What about that moment?
Because he and also he says, no one, this kid's weird. Yeah, he's weird, but he was the only one that, ever talked to me in the gifted program when we lived in the trailer park.
Yeah.
That was when I loved that kid.
I know, and it's funny, like, you have to love your characters. You have to love the despicable ones, too. You really do. To write them well. And so, it is. And then you have to let bad things happen to them. Kurt Vonnegut said you have to create characters, like, part of his rules of storytelling is you need to create at least one character that you love and that your readers can root for. And then you have to be a sadist to that character. But it's kind of true. And it's to find out what your character's made of. Bad things have to happen. And I definitely felt that way too. In reading the book, when I go to read it again, I read this book like 7 times in its entirety out loud to listen to every sentence. And I do that. I've done that now in my ebook a few times, like 4 or 5 times already. And that's where you get voice, and that's really where I can feel like it's like inhabiting. This character started very much me and ended up very much somewhere else. And in a way that I think made for better writing, easier to edit, and it gave me a little remove. And it also gave me a little remove to see my childhood. There's a line in The Great Gatsby where Nick, the narrator's at a party, and he says that he feels both like, I felt, at that moment I was without, he's looking out a window at New York, and he's like, I felt both without and within. where I felt like I was out on the street looking in and looking down. And I feel like that's what writing, I feel like F. Scott Fitzgerald in that moment is saying that's what writing can do. You're in and you're out at the same time, telling a story. Yeah.
Another real powerful moment, I think, for the book group that read this book through the library is the father out there with the mother in the garden replanting is it lilies or
Yeah,
lilies
lilies.
or something, and he's
Yeah.
holding her, and it's going to be a very powerful.
Yeah. I feel like there were a lot of moments like that. Yeah, like my father was like the nicest person and like the best person, but he's not like gonna verbalize much, and he doesn't have access to his emotions like readily. And not that I blame him. I mean, he was raised by people who were raised during the Great Depression. His father, my grandfather was in World War II. Like you can go back and be like, oh, not very many generations before we're in the 1800s and no one has running water and people are just trying to survive. Like, I feel like we're not that far removed from that. And so I feel like there were so many moments where I saw my parents do that, especially when my dad just had to do little things like help my mother from the bed up to the couch and back. So these moments centers. So I knew I wanted that in there. I worked really hard on the parents. I worked harder on the parents than any other characters because I really did not want to offend my parents. And I didn't want to feel like I was taking shots at them. I had no axe to grind against them. When my kids were born, I remember thinking like, oh, this is great. It's going to help me know how to write kids. And I was like, no, you idiot. You were a kid. As soon as my kids were born, I forgave my parents for so many things. So many things. Like almost like immediately, because I was like, oh my God, this is hard. And in a lot of ways, you're just, I don't want to say winging it as a parent, but like, you don't always know what to do, and like one of them's like teetering on the edge of the couch, and the other one has like somehow has like a knife in their hand. And you're like, how did this happen? You're like, what do I do in this moment? Get the knife first. But like so much, I couldn't judge them anymore, and it allowed me to like really work on them. And my parents have always loved each other, and that was always clear. And so I wanted that to be in there. And we did have lilies that like went around the back of our house. We always had that bag. That like poison bag for like June bugs, like those beetles that was always all summer long so heavy. Do people
Japanese
Yeah,
beetles.
we have them out now.
At this point in the summer, they just like heavy with dead beetles.
They stink.
No. What did you say?
They stink.
They stink. I imagine that's not I don't know, organic. Whatever's in that death bag. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you guys. I'm gonna have to say it's like a dream. I thought the dream would be selling books, and I think the dream is like just talking to people who have read the book. We spend so much time just sitting and thinking about every single word over and over and over again for years, and then to have people engage with it is the magic. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully it's soon.
Thank you once again, Dave, for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for coming and for participating in the 2023 Community Read. Can't wait to see the number 12 and see what happens. But this was a great delight to have Dave come and tell us, let us pick his brain and no bra questions. That was great. Very polite crowd.
Sometimes those happen after. Just someone comes over and nudges me. Is like, what's the deal? I will say quickly about the bras. I remember my mother read the book, and we got through all the stuff, the heaviness from childhood, all this stuff. And then after, our neighbor was Pete and Ginny. Like Ginny was the mother in this house. And my mother just goes, "Are you stealing Ginny's bras as a kid?" No, Mom, it's art. It's like this. It's not. She gave me this look. I was like, I swear. I still don't think she believes me. So
Our Crumb would creep into his mom's closet at like 5 years old and hang on to her tall boots, so there's always that aspect of art. The stuff that you hide.
yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.